It was a foggy February day on Sanibel Island, and I was walking down the beach when this sandwich tern was coming back from, well, quite honestly, I don't know if it was coming back from a foraging trip or just from somewhere else on the beach where it may have been spooked and taken off. But the plan, or its plan at least, ran into a small problem, and that problem was me. Now, while I was certainly in the wrong place for this tern that was landing, I was in the right place to potentially make a great image. At least that would be the case as long as I was fast enough to do it. What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to the channel. So this is the first episode in a new series of videos that I'm putting together where I'm looking at the story and the lessons that I learned behind some of my favorite pictures, or at least behind pictures that have some of my favorite stories. So this picture is a tern in the fog, and it is a tale of, well, terns and fog. So as I said in the introduction, the story here is that I was walking down the beach. It was February 10th, 2011. I was on Sanibel Island. I shot this actually just after noon, which normally if you are, have been doing photography for more than about 5 minutes, you know that that's not normally going to be a great time to be out to take pictures. The light's going to be very harsh. You're going to have very hard shadows. It's just not going to be a great time to make images. But when you're shooting with fog or overcast days, for that matter, you don't have a hard light problem. You have almost the opposite problem, that there is virtually no hardness in the light. That is all soft. It is like shooting in a giant softbox. So anyway, I was walking down the beach. I was out hoping to, it was a foggy, so on foggy days, if you're not a bird photographer, you generally aren't going to have a lot of activity. Birds have to be able to see to fly, and so if it's really foggy or dark or whatever, night, when I say dark, they're just not going to be flying. They're going to be snuggled up somewhere on the beach, and they're only going to really take off if they absolutely have to. So I wasn't really expecting to get much in the way of birds in flight, but I was hoping to get to be able to leverage the soft light to be able to get some stuff of terns or shorebirds on the ground. And that wasn't really happening much either this particular day. I was walking down the beach. There wasn't a lot happening bird-wise. But I had my head on a swivel, and as any good photographer should when you're out, whether you're doing landscapes or portraits or cityscapes, or pretty much anything, if you're not looking for an image, you're never going to find an image to shoot. And that's kind of the first step you have to make in taking an image, taking a picture. Is you have to be looking for that picture to make. So anyway, I'm head on a swivel and I'm walking down the beach, and lo and behold, I looked out to sea, or looked back, I don't remember what exactly, and as I was looking out to sea, here's this sandwich tern, and it's gear down, flaps down, it is coming into land, and it basically at the last possible minute sees that I'm standing there where it thought it was going to land, and starts maneuvering to not land on my head. And that's where the great pose comes from. And I think part of that is what makes this image, in that if I had just been, if it just been a head-on sandwich tern, I mean, I don't know if it would have been as interesting of an image. But with the dynamic of the tern turning, I think it made a much better image. So the technical aspects of this image, I always personally, when I'm looking at pictures I always look at how the photographer shot them. So like lens, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, that kind of thing. I don't care so much about the camera, because it doesn't matter that much. The camera, for most cases, the camera doesn't matter at all. In fact, like 99.99% of cases, the camera doesn't matter at all. But the lens tells you something about distance, tells you something about skill, tells you something about whatnot. So, technical aspects of this image. I shot this on a Canon EOS 1D Mark III, so 10 megapixel, 10 frame per second. It was their photojournalist's, professional photojournalist body back in 2008, 2010. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with that camera. I really liked the camera in a lot of ways, and I really didn't like the camera in a lot of ways. And the biggest limitation that I felt that camera had was the fact that it used an APS-H sensor. So it was a 1.3 crop factor. Put a smaller sensor in a full-frame mirror box, so you couldn't use crop lenses with it. But your full-frame wide-angle lenses just weren't as wide as they would be if you were shooting on a full-frame camera. And on the other hand, when you were shooting telephoto, you had a 30% narrower angle of view than in your images, but because the resolution of the sensor was only 10 megapixel, if you compared it to the 1DS Mark III, which was the 21 megapixel full-frame studio counterpart, the actual effective reach of the camera was worse. So you could either, on a 1DS, you could either crop to 10 megapixels and you'd get a 40% crop factor instead of a 30% crop factor, or you could crop to the 30% mark and you get a higher resolution out of it. So that was, I think, the biggest limit. Well, compared to today, I mean, the camera was, that was the biggest limitation I saw in the camera at the time. But compared to today, it's, there's so much stuff that, and I will talk about a little bit in this video, there's so much stuff where the technology has improved so much in 10 years that it's pretty amazing, I think. So for exposure, I was at a 2500th of a second at f5.6 and ISO 400. And this is where being around noon really helped with the sun directly overhead, high in the sky. Even though it was foggy and the light was very soft, there was a lot of light to work with. If it had been earlier in the morning, I would not have had the 2500th of a second shutter speed. I wouldn't really have been able to freeze action quite as well, or I'd have to push the ISO up, and 400 on the 1D was a pretty good ISO to shoot at. Once you got to 1600, it kind of fell apart a little bit. It wasn't as good. I'm very comfortable on the R5 shooting at 16 or 3200 and knowing that I'll have a good image when I get out of it. When with the 1D, I really didn't want to go above 800 if I could help it. So for the lens, I'm shooting an EF 70-200 f4L IS-USM with a 1.4x teleconverter, and I was shooting at a metadata saved value of 141 millimeters. So that means that the lens was set to 100 millimeters in the zoom position. The teleconverter made that 141 millimeters basically. And then the actual full frame equivalent angle of view would have been 184 millimeters with the 1.3 crop factor. So under 200 millimeters, which is pretty close, pretty tight, or pretty wide, I should say, for a bird photography situation. But this also gives you an idea of how close all of this was. So I was shooting, a sandwich tern has a wingspan of about 32 inches. And if you've ever worked with a 200 millimeter lens, you know that 32 inches is not, fills the frame at not that far away. I don't have to do the math on this. The camera logs your focus distance, and in the case of this situation, my focus distance on the camera, or saved on the camera, was less than 17.5 feet, or 5.3 meters. So all told, the bird probably, I saw the bird when it was probably 25 or 30 feet away, maybe a bit longer than that, and by the time it had turned to be a photographically uninteresting situation, it was maybe 10 feet away or something to that effect. So this is all happening very close and ultimately very fast. So as I said, for lenses, I chose to use the 70-200 f4 LIS USM and a teleconverter. At the time, I had two telephoto lenses that I could use. I had a 100-400, it was Canon's first generation EF 100-400, and I had the 70-200. And by and large, with few exceptions, and this was one of those exceptions, I did not really use the 70-200 as much as I maybe would have liked to. The 100 to 400 is my go-to. It was my go-to, and the Mark II became my go-to, and now on RF platform, the 100 to 500 is my go-to telephoto lens, pretty much to the exclusion of everything else. I will carry, like if I'm going somewhere to like not even shoot wildlife and I just want a telephoto lens, I will often take the 100 to 400 or 100 to 500 and my 70 to 24 to 70, and I'll just ignore the fact I don't have coverage from 70 to 100 and just roll with it. But the first generation 100 to 400 was optically great, but from a reliability and mechanical quality side of things, wasn't necessarily as much of an L lens as I would have liked it to be. So it wasn't weather sealed. It was a push-pull zoom, and don't get me wrong, I don't have anything against push-pull zooms, but the design Canon chose for this was it wasn't weather sealed, and it had a running problem where if you got dust or contamination on the inner lens barrel, which is the one that's fixed to the camera, not the one that slides, you could, and didn't clean that off before you zoomed the lens out, then you would have a situation where you could contaminate the bearing and locking mechanism in the camera, and when you did that, ultimately what would happen is things would wear and degrade inside and the lens would lock up. And this ultimately happened to me. So while I loved the lens from an optical perspective, anytime I was going to be in an environment that was very dusty or very sandy or very, harsh like that, I didn't particularly care to take this lens or to use this lens. On top of the physical situation of just having dust and everything, the fact that I was shooting in fog meant that I wasn't going to have to be shooting very far, or wasn't effective to shoot very far, so I just didn't see a point going full 100 to 400. Now, whether I needed the teleconverter is obviously somewhat debatable. I still prefer to give birds and wildlife as much breathing space as possible because it seems like it's the right thing to do. I don't really think that you need to get right on top of anything, really. But again, you're going to have limited contrast and you're not going to be able to work at super far distances. But the teleconverter did give me a 280 millimeter effective focal length at the telephoto end, which is pretty close to 300, and the crop factor would push it over 300, which seemed like a reasonable compromise between the foggy conditions and limited contrast and shooting through all of that and the not having to try and crawl up on top of anything to get a good picture. So, bad weather. I am possibly a little weird. I actually like going out in bad weather. I like shooting in bad weather. I like, as long as it's not a life-threatening situation, like a thunderstorm, and I have the appropriate gear, like rain jackets and pants and so forth, or cold weather gear, whatever. Being out in bad weather is not a real negative to me. It's not something that I just try to avoid at all costs. From a photographic perspective, this has an added, call it benefit, whatever you want to call it, situation, in that there's a completely different story to be had in bad weather from good weather. So everybody is very familiar with the idyllic go out, shoot at golden hour type images, and you have these wonderful, calm, idyllic, great light, serene images of whatever it is that you're shooting. And that's great, and I shoot those, and I like those, and I appreciate those as much as everybody else, but that's not the only story that's out there. And as a photographer, we're visual storytellers, telling stories is what this is really all about. And so there's a huge difference in the story between say bison grazing in Yellowstone at golden hour on a beautiful day and a bison grazing in a snowstorm. The latter case, the bison has to be out there grazing. It doesn't necessarily want to be out there grazing, but it has to be out there grazing, and it tells a completely different story. The other reason that I like shooting in bad weather is that, and this is maybe purely personal or purely just capability wise or whatever, but I have always had, and somewhat still do to a certain extent, have a problem with dealing with backgrounds when shooting wildlife and action. I get so involved mentally in watching what's the bear or the bird or whatever is doing that I don't have or don't spend the time to think about what is, would the background be better if I moved 10 feet to the right? Like, I'm in the heat of the moment, and I've never really been good at that. And shooting in a fog or shooting when it's raining or snowing or whatever goes a huge way to helping clean up backgrounds. So you lose the contrast, and instead of having bright spots and dark spots in the background, everything works towards a more mid-toned, lower contrast type situation. So for me at least, part of the reason that I like shooting in bad weather is, aside from it tells a different story and gives you slightly different backgrounds, like really dark skies and things like that from a storm cloud, is that it helps clean up backgrounds in a way that I'm not always good with when I'm shooting in a brighter situation. So post-processing on this was extensive or minimal, depending on how you want to look at it. I tweaked the image in both Lightroom and Photoshop. The biggest change to the whole thing was a recomposition move in Photoshop. So the deal with the 1D and really any DSLR that we've gotten away from with our mirrorless cameras now is that they concentrate all the focus points in the center of the frame. And as a result, generally speaking, your compositions for dynamic situations like this are going to be more central. You just can't push the subject off to the side as much because there isn't the autofocus capability there, or wasn't the autofocus capability to do that. Now, with mirrorless cameras and full sensor tracking abilities and all the capabilities that we have now, it's a completely different cup of tea. It's totally different in that we can basically put the subject anywhere in the frame and still focus and track it. But that wasn't the case in 2010, 2011. So the autofocus tech forced a central composition, and I really prefer a composition for this to be slightly more offset with more breathing room to the direction that the bird is ultimately turning. Fortunately, again, because of the clean background from the fog, it was a real easy fix to readjust things in Photoshop to get the bird moved. The additional adjustments that I made was to cool the light, the color temperature down. The natural situation was way warmer than was much warmer than the situation that I thought it looked good at. And I also added some negative clarity, which seems like counterintuitive or counterproductive, considering that I had all of this shutter speed to get a sharp image, and then I'm blurring out the details with the negative clarity. But I think it just worked a little bit better with the way I was sort of imagining this image and remembering this image after the fact. So the big lesson from this image that I really wanted to talk about is basically this picture for me drove home a concept that I was starting to solidify at the time but hadn't completely solidified, which was being really proficient with your camera gear. And by really proficient, I mean like practice and train to know where every button is until it's instinctive, and practice with the zoom rings and focus rings until you are super intimately comfortable with which way they turn and to focus or zoom in a given direction. So the reality is, in wildlife photography, at least in my experience, is that you're always playing catch up. You're always behind the curve. Doesn't really matter what you do. You can't, there's certain things that can help you sort of get a start on things, but you don't know where the bird's going to be. You don't know where the bear's going to be. You don't know if it's going to turn towards you or fly somewhere else, or be anything be a good picture opportunity or not. This whole situation in this picture took place in a couple of seconds, less than 5 total, from when I saw the bird to when I no longer could shoot the bird. And that's already, as I said, putting you on, you're behind the curve. You're playing catch up. If you then are not comfortable with your camera and you're turning the lens the wrong way, or you're turning the zoom ring the wrong way, or you're turning a dial the wrong way for exposure compensation, or example, I use dual rear button focusing for now. It wasn't available when I shot this image on the 1D, but I basically have one rear button focus button that is basically this is how the camera is, however I've configured the camera. It could be one shot, it could be servo, it's whatever the camera is set to. My other button is set up for basically panic bird, take picture, action. And so it is set to servo, it's set to full area tracking, it's set to subject detection, all of those things. So that in a situation like this, where I might not have been prepared for a tracking flight shot because birds aren't flying on a foggy day, I just hit the second autofocus on button and all of a sudden the camera is doing tracking flight shots. So if I wasn't ultimately comfortable with where that button was, and that wasn't just part of my old mental workflow to hit that button and off I go, then that would have been putting me even further behind the curve. And ultimately, if I had with the combination of, say, not knowing focus ring direction, or not knowing zoom ring direction, not knowing which button to hit, in a very fast situation like this, it would be very easy to miss that. Now, fortunately, as I said, at this point, I had been already sort of beginning to work on the idea of really getting this down. And I would do things like I would sit in front of my computer, put on something like Planet Earth, and practice with the camera to focus on a bird or focus on something, and have something come up, just in whatever situation that was happening. You don't obviously need to use Planet Earth or a nature video or something like that, but having just a low impact, low requirement sort of drill that you could train with to really get familiar with the camera was something that this, like I said, really drove home to me, and ultimately would become very relevant going forward. I would run into more and more situations with wildlife where not being completely on the ball with the camera would not or would either impair me, or having that training and practice with the camera would make it possible to do something that people that I was shooting with would miss because they didn't have the responsiveness with their cameras. And even today, I haven't really sat down and practiced the way I did back in 2010 or so. And I can tell, like I could especially tell when I was in Yellowstone last year, or the year before, last year, whatever, that shooting with the R5s, it was the first time I was shooting with the R5s in a wildlife context, that there were places where I really could tell like I was behind the curve and I needed to work with the camera more just to be able to rock and roll at the pace of what was happening in front of me. So this was a Tern in the fog, the story behind that photo. If you thought this was interesting or at least useful, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.